Thank you for giving me this opportunity to present. Along with the honor comes the responsibility to do justice to TIM Division's rich history and the many discourses around it. It is for this reason that I have titled my talk as a distinctive place for the TIM Division at the Academy of Management. Any talk is given from a certain perspective, and so is mine. Consequently, I will first connect the dots that define me. I will then get into the TIM Division's operative terms, which are technology, innovation, and management, and scope out three global challenges that the TIM Division is uniquely poised to address. I'll offer one perspective, which I will call as the platform perspective, to approach these challenges, and I will conclude by affirming TIM's distinctive place at the Academy of Management. There are many technologies that I've either worked with or have written about, which are depicted out here in this slide. It is beyond the scope of this talk today to get into each and every one of these technologies, and each of my experiences tells its own story. The one to the extreme left is a picture of a chemical processing plant. And I go to this because during my undergraduate days, I was studying chemical engineering. Eventually, I was given a bachelor's of technology in chemical engineering, and I always wondered why it was a bachelor's of technology. I perhaps have an answer today, which I'll become clearer as I give this talk. The picture next to that is one of a rotary hermetic compressor. I was a project manager initially in India, charged with the responsibility of putting up a plant for rotary hermetic compressors. To do so, I traveled Southeast Asia, in particular Japan and the UK. And during my travels, I was confronted with the question, why, despite the talent in India that I'd seen, India was still a developing country. Partly to address that question, I decided to pursue a PhD. And I landed up at the University of Minnesota. There, I was very fortunate to bump into Andy Van de Ven, who had just begun the Minnesota Innovation Research Project, MERP as it was called. Andy had taken on an approach which he labeled as engaged scholarship. And I was one of the persons engaging between the project and 3M Corporation. Andy also was subscribing to innovation as process, and that required to follow and track these innovations longitudinally. And I did so with a specific innovation which I was looking at for the 5 years that I was doing my PhD. I was surrounded by many scholars who had taken on different disciplines. For instance, sociology, economics, and psychology. What discipline did I belong to? I asked myself. I do remember one fine day at one of the 10,000 lakes in Minnesota. It dawned upon me in a flash that technology was my home discipline. In that, I could see the other disciplines also play out, economics, sociology, and psychology, and more. That was truly liberating. Another incident which happened during my PhD was that I came across a book edited by Biker, Hughes, and Pinch, The Social Construction of Technological Systems. In that book, I came across constructs such as frames of reference, levels of inclusion, institutional closure, and most importantly, interpretive flexibility. This was truly revelatory for me because understanding these constructs and how they apply to technology showed me that we need not have a view of technology as being deterministic. And we have the facility to open up the technology black box to our advantage. From these experiences, what can I offer budding scholars? I'd like to say first that your PhD days matter. They were most formative for me. And during this period, you are creating not just a product, but more importantly, establishing a platform. The platform that I established under the guidance of my advisors, including Andy Van de Ven, has served me very well. Of course, your advisors matter, but most importantly, it is you as a member of multiple visible and invisible colleges who matters. Which brings me to the next part of my talk, the three operative terms that define the TIM division. They are, of course, technology, innovation, and management. And needless to say that given my prior experiences, the TIM division was my first and natural home that I could belong. But what exactly is technology? In search for an answer, I go back to the Greeks, who defined techne as skill with art or craft. Here you see a definition which is uniquely human, that we can craft and mold metal. We can shape environments around us, create new worlds around us. And in these tasks, the human species is distinct from other species. I'd like to provide three perspectives on technology. I first came across Joan Woodward's work, where she talks about three or multiple kinds of technologies, which are mass, batch, and flow. And her core thesis is that the organizations around them are going to be very different. Here we see a contingency view of technology, which I call as technology moderates interactions. The second view is from Susan Lee Starr's work. She offered the notion of boundary objects, and she gave an example of maps around which members of different occupational groups could interact. I labeled this as technology mediates interactions. We can well imagine other boundary objects, such as PowerPoints, around which we can interact. In my work with Caroline Bartel, we have conceptualized stories and narratives as boundary objects around which employees can interact to innovate. But going beyond technology as moderators and mediators, I'd like to offer a third view, and that is that technology constitutes interactions. What do I mean by that? A simple example will help. If we use a telephone, it constitutes a certain kind of interaction as compared to a Twitter or Facebook, for instance. Indeed, many scholars have picked up on James Gibson's work of affordances to try to understand how different technologies can be constructed and designed to constitute different kinds of interactions. I'd like to provide one example to further clarify what I mean by the three concepts of technology, that is, it moderates, mediates, or constitutes. These are from Uber's pitch deck. And on the left, you see Uber Cabs, as the company was called at that time. And on the right-hand side, you see the medallion system. Clearly, the technologies which are used to gain these services will determine and are shaping the kinds of services that we can get. In that sense, the technology is moderating between these two different kinds of services. And this is the argument that Uber Cabs, Uber now as it's called, was making in order to be categorized as a service company which was different from a medallion system. If you go deeper into the app itself, you will find that the app is it's a platform which connects two different sides of the market. One are the providers of the service, which are drivers, and the second ones are the users of the service. And so in this case, the technology is mediating, and the transaction costs are reduced, allowing for this to happen. If you go further deeper into the app itself and the platform, the way it has been designed, one can see that the technology also constitutes. I'll just draw attention to just 2 points in the slide to the right. One, for instance, that it is through these apps that the routes are being optimized and prices are being dynamically set. And it is through these apps that has a capacity for reputation tracking. So this is the constitutive view of interactions because of the technology itself. Which takes me to the next part of my slide, of my talk. That is, what is innovation? I'd like to quote Dr. Bill Coyne, this 3M Senior Vice President of R&D, who noted, our difficulty in grasping the process of innovation is vexing. Successful innovation brings us joy and confidence and well-being. It generates long-term sustainable growth. Once we have tasted this wonderful experience, we want to experience it again, but we are frequently confounded. The process is non-linear and it cannot be managed in traditional ways. In this quotation, I'd like to draw attention to a couple of things. First is successful innovation brings us joy. And in drawing attention to successful innovation, I'd like to point out that these are substances and outcomes that we typically look at and say, this is innovation. However, Bill Coyne goes beyond that. He says, behind the successful innovations are our difficulty in grasping the process of innovation is vexing. He draws attention to process, which is in the first line. And then he says the process is nonlinear and it cannot be managed in traditional ways. I draw upon work by Nicholas Rescher to bring out the substance process duality, which is implicated in Bill Coyne's statement. Rescher says that there are two different ways of looking at the world. One, that it is full of substances or entities, as they call them. And these entities are discrete, fixed, stable, and passive. And if you want to change something, one has to change these entities from this perspective. But there's a completely different way of looking at the world, that it is in constant flux and flow. And rather than discreteness, you see wholeness. Rather than fixity, you see interactivity. Rather than stability, you see fluidity. And rather than passivity, agency. This he labels as the process philosophy. So what are the implications of taking these two perspectives on innovation? Innovation and substance has taken us a long way. We have made many distinctions, and productively so, between incremental, architectural, modular, radical, discontinuous, disruptive, and on and on. This has enabled us to study innovations, their antecedents and their consequences, and what we need to do to organize around them. But if you remember Bill Coyne's statement, it's a process, and any innovation at any point in time could be a hopeful monstrosity. How might we classify them? In other words, what is the process behind the substance? I'd like to quote Francis Bacon, who said, as the births of living creatures at first are ill-shapen, so are all innovations, which are the births of time. I'll give an example of an hopeful monstrosity or an ill-shapen part of the substance before it's become an innovation, and that's a pet rock. And going back to Francis Bacon, he says that as the births of living creatures at first are ill-shapen, so are all innovations, which are the births of time. And in that, which are the births of time, he brings in process into play. Here's one chart of enthusiasm, despair. And if you were to talk to any person who has gone through this process, you will find there are ups and downs. You have an idea and it works, you feel excited. No, it does not. Yes, it does. And on and on. It's not proprietary. Customers like it. Costs are too high. New cost model. I have a fix. And on and on. And these are the ups and downs and the journeys that people go through. And in that process, not only is the product or the idea transformed, but so too are the people. This is a process of innovation. In our own work, Andy Van Deven and colleagues and myself, we found the same kind of process going on. And this is an iconic chart which comes out of our research, the Minnesota Innovation Research Project. It looks messy, and it was supposed to depict the messy process. There's a long period of gestation. There's a proliferation of plans. There are shocks, setbacks, shifts in criteria, termination of projects, reuse of products, fluid participation, not only of organizational personnel, but with others on the top, as well as the development of infrastructure. "3M CEO rightly put it this way: invention is by its very nature a disorderly process. You can't put a Six Sigma process into this area and say, well, I'm getting behind on invention, so I'm going to schedule myself for 3 good ideas on Wednesday and 2 on Friday. That's not how creativity works. I'd like to talk a little bit about my own experiences from this substance process duality. I was studying the cochlear implant being developed by 3M Corporation. The cochlear implant is a biomedical device which is implanted into the ear of profoundly deaf people, giving them a sensation of sound. What I found was, from all the studies, that different people have different ways of engaging with the world, which I call as a socio-cognitive model. And this way of engaging with the world has got 3 components. One, the beliefs of the people as to what is possible and what they want to do. Evaluation criteria as to what is good and what is bad. And the technologies and the artifacts which they use. And I found that these 3 facets co-evolve and create a socio-cognitive way of approaching the world. On the top, you see the substances, and the bottom, you see processes. From the many cochlear implants designs that I came across, the 2 which were predominant was 3M's single channel device and Nucleus's multi-channel device. The single channel device, both of them, by the way, single channel and multi-channel, were given FDA approvals, which is a huge thing, of course. The single channel devices, 3M, they wanted to provide a product which would allow the deaf to continue operating in their deaf culture, in the deaf world, and yet have the facility to interact with those in the hearing world when they had to. In other words, for 3M, the cochlear implant was a mediator. It mediated the interactions between the deaf and the hearing world. In contrast, the people who are pushing and proponents of the multi-channel wanted to provide the profoundly deaf the ability to have speech hearing, and they wanted to reconstitute the deaf as full members, active members of the hearing world. In other words, they had taken a view of technology as being constitutive. Well, behind the substance was a tremendous amount of process as to how these 2 came about. I cannot spend too much time to talk about those, except to say that each one of them had got 3 different approaches to the beliefs, evaluation criteria, and artifacts that they had chosen. As I mentioned before, 3M had chosen to believe that it was best to allow the deaf to operate in the deaf culture, whereas the multi-channel proponents wanted them to come into the hearing world. And accordingly, the evaluation criteria varied between the two, so much so that the clinical data which was generated were very, very different. Each one of them had got different approaches to what is the meaning of safety and what is efficacy, the two sub-criteria which FDA is interested in. And each one of them had chosen different artifacts. In the case of single channel, for instance, a shallow insertion of the electrode. In the case of multi-channel, a deeper insertion with multiple cochlea. The battle went on, so much so that after many years, despite clinical trials, the controversy could not be resolved. Under these conditions, NIH used to call what is called as the Consensus Development Program. And that is, they would call the top scientists from around the world to congregate in Maryland to decide which is the more fruitful way to go. And they did so in 1988 as well, to decide which was the way to go. I was very fortunate to be there. And within 3 days, this group of people, I think there were hundreds of scientists who had accumulated, they came to a conclusion that the current evidence suggests that multi-channel stimulation produces superior speech recognition performance compared with single channel stimulation. So in 3 days, there was an institutional closure. And even though there was this outcome did not have any legal binding, it had a huge impact on 3M, which was proceeding with the single channel device, and they decided to bow out. In the meantime, because of this result and the desire to reconstitute the deaf themselves rejected the cochlear implant, surprisingly so. So here is a cartoon from Silent News, a newspaper for the deaf. And you see before, on the left-hand side, before, a happy deaf child, normal ASL using member of the deaf community. On the right-hand side, there is after, it's an unhappy child forced into years of intensive speech therapy to try to fit in a hearing world with no chance of being normal and scarred for life. I want to read the last part again, with no chance of being normal and scarred for life, in order to try to fit in a hearing world. In other words, the deaf were being crippled by the kindness. So what can we learn from all of this for our discipline, for the research that we conduct? For the purposes of this talk, I just divide the work we do into two camps. One is variance and the second is process. Variance and process, the distinction made by Larry Moore and subsequently carried forward by scholars like Andy Van de Ven and Langley Haritsukas and other people. Variance theories and methods try to establish efficient causation between independent and dependent variables. Process theorization moves away from efficient causation. Variables might be necessary, but not sufficient. Moreover, one looks for patterns across events and the driving forces and motors. They are very, very different approaches to looking at the world, just like the substance-process duality that I had introduced before. More importantly, each one of them has got different socio-cognitive approaches to doing so. There are different theories, different quality criteria, and different methods. So, if you want to do variance or process, it is very important to come to know what you're doing. It is possible that you may have conducted a variance research, and it is reviewed by people who take a process approach. It will be unfairly evaluated. And vice versa, it is possible that you do a process research and it could be viewed from people who are doing variance research. And again, it'll be improperly evaluated. So what can we do as authors? One, explicate the onto-epistemic axiological position within the paper. By ontology, I mean the theories. By epistemology, I mean the methods, and axiological is the value criteria and the values. Send the manuscript to journals that are appreciative of the approach taken. And finally, suggest editors and reviewers who understand the position taken, who can offer a quality review. Which brings me to the next part of my talk. We have discussed what is technology, what is innovation, and now what is management. I go back to the early 1900s, the days of Frederick Taylor, Gantt, Henry Ford, and a lot of this has been captured by Robert Kanigel in his book titled The One Best Way. I'd like to read for you a memo from Frederick Taylor to Dodge of Link Belt Company. In that he says, the success of the system rests primarily upon two important elements. First, absolutely rigid and inflexible standards throughout your establishment. And second, that every employee of your establishment should receive every day clear-cut, definite instructions as to just what he is to do and how he is to do it. And these instructions should be exactly carried out, whether they are right or wrong. Just imagine being in a system in which instructions should be exactly carried out, whether they are right or wrong. In fact, it has been stated that they were being paid to do, employees were being paid to do and not to think. Of course, one can try to imagine why this was the case, because they were trying to set in motion an assembly line system for creating mass production of interoperable parts. And yet you can also imagine the impact on innovation. Let's compare this with a statement made by 3M CEO William McKnight. And he said, mistakes will be made, but are not so serious in the long run as the mistakes management makes if it is dictatorial and undertakes to tell those under its authority exactly how they must do their jobs. I want to draw your attention to what he says. He's saying that management mistakes could be far more problematic than those made by people who know how to do the jobs and who may make informed mistakes. He is inverting the hierarchy, and he says management that is destructively critical when mistakes are made kills initiative, and it's essential that we have many people with initiative if we are to continue to grow. He is essentially countering what Taylor did in his statement before. The two approaches between what Taylor said and Bill McKnight said capture two different approaches to organizing amongst the many others. One of them is hierarchy, simply put, and second is heterarchy. Hierarchy, for purposes of today's talk, implicates modular decomposition, a term that I'm using from Herbert Simon's near decomposability, of creating boxes within boxes. Each of the decomposed parts, there is a redundancy of parts, because if one part fails, then there's a second part to take its place. It leads to an equilibrium, like in the Six Sigma case, but the equilibrium is static. In contrast, and building upon work on our research with Philip Trocher, Arun Kumaraswamy, and myself of the Atlas CERN particle detector at Geneva, interlaced knowledge replaces modular decomposition, by which I mean that these parts have got knowledge about what other parts have also got. So the knowledge is not fully specific to each particular part, as a consequence of which there's a redundancy of functions, and the equilibrium which is generated is dynamic rather than static, because these parts are always interacting with each other. These are two different approaches to organizing, and it is true that both might be required. Based on this, I asked this question: how might we view innovation and organization as interrelated entities, where innovation is a part of organizing and not apart from it? How is it possible to organize and innovate and organize as an ongoing flow so that organizations support innovation rather than organizations oppose and resist it? One way is for hierarchy and heterarchy to operate together. So for this, I would like to go back to 3M Corporation and give one example. And in this diagram, which comes from 3M, we can see the traditional approaches, which is divisions, groups, market centers, staff functions such as R&D, marketing, manufacturing, and sales. But I'd like to draw your attention to technology platforms. These are assemblages, accumulations of knowledge. And when I was interacting with 3M, I believe they had 23 technology platforms. 3M has this statement that technologies belong to the corporation and the products to the division. And the reason for that is the product innovations are the responsibilities for the divisions. However, the knowledge base on which this resides can be used by anyone in the company, and therefore it belongs to the corporation. They support this through mechanisms. On the right, you'll see conferences, councils, and forums, which allow for the pollination of ideas across the platforms into the divisions and the various other centers. And the climate for innovation also really helps 3M to do this, two of which are bootlegging. That is, if the assets belong and the knowledge belongs to the company, then you're free to use it. And along with that is 3M's 15% rule, which is basically that 15% of your time you could explore those ideas that you're passionate about without seeking the approval of your superiors. In that 15% rule, you can see the inversion of the hierarchy, giving the decision rights to individuals to explore what they think is important. But of course, a 50% rule also implies 85% exploitation. 85% of the time you're exploiting. So here are some statements about the technology platforms at 3M. One is one key ingredient that has allowed 3M to be innovative, not in 1 year or in 2 years, but over a sustained period of time, has been its selectivity and aggressiveness in identifying and investing into significant technology platforms that are applicable to multiple markets. These technology platforms create options, real options, which can be used and reused and applied when the time is right. It gives 3M the dynamic capabilities it requires to survive and grow. The cross-fertilization, which I mentioned earlier, here's one more statement, which says, we have annual events where many laboratories will present their technologies. Within our technology center, we sponsor a symposium every other year where we review all the current programs based on microreplication. We regularly exchange personnel with other technology centers. The main objective of all of this is the cross-fertilization of ideas. I studied at 3M one technology platform, which is microreplication technology platform. And that platform was the basis and has been the basis for multiple products. The two which I studied, one of them is adhesives to your right, you'll see that. And this has been an age-old product from 3M. And by combining the old technology with microreplication technology, 3M was able to create a disruptive innovation internally to their own benefit. The second technology which I studied was in the illumination category. And the one which I studied was brightness enhancement film, the BEF. And this is a film which is coated onto your laptops, directing the light from the laptop towards your eyes, thereby reducing battery consumption. In fact, the BEF has been found to be one of the top 10 innovations for the laptop. So let me summarize where we have reached. I asked this question, what do the three operative terms, technology, innovation, management mean? And I offered some perspectives on that. Technology could moderate interactions, they could mediate interactions, and they can constitute interactions. These are fundamentally different ways of viewing technologies, and the way we view technologies will come back to shape who we are and what we can do with them. I talked about innovation as both substance and process. And I believe that, again, depending on how you see this, you will then manage that accordingly. Management, the third one, could be hierarchy or heterarchy. And this is a critical question about who has decision rights. With a hierarchy, it is concentrated, whereas with a heterarchy, it is distributed. Over the years, since I've been a member of the TIM division, I've seen a steady progress from my thinking of technology as a moderator, innovation as substances, management hierarchy, to technology's constitutive role, innovation as process, and management as heterarchy. I think that as the world becomes more and more interconnected and more dynamic, and as we cede agency to technologies such as bots, algos, artificial intelligence, and on, we will increasingly go from the left-hand side, that is technology as moderator, innovation as substances, and management as hierarchy, to the right-hand side, to view the constitutive roles of technology and the processes of innovation involved and the distribution of decision rights as in management as heterarchy. I'd like to now take some time to talk about 3 global challenges that the world confronts, which TIM is uniquely poised to address. They are COVID-19, the rise of artificial intelligence, and sustainability. Dealing with the pandemic caused by COVID-19 at the intersection of science, technology, innovation, management, politics, philanthropy, economy is a fascinating research point of view. Of course, it is very tragic what we're going through. But I think as a consequence, TIM has a very unique position to offer something important because of our understanding of what technology and platforms can play, how innovation processes can unfold, and how management as distributed agency can work out. The second one, the rise of artificial intelligence, has been happening. We have been ceding agency to bots, algos, and other kinds of products which are now shaping who we are. So much so that Elon Musk had this to say: we are headed towards a situation where AI is vastly smarter than humans. And he concludes, it just means that things get unstable and weird. Are we equipped? What should TIM do is the question. And the third challenge is sustainability. For long, we have followed Schumpeter's creative destruction and brought it down to innovation to show that we can keep on innovating continually, as in the Red Queen effect. However, unfortunately, our quest for keeping ahead because of creative destruction has led to a situation of destructive creation. What do I mean by that? That we are producing and consuming at rates which are unprecedented, and all the innovations that we have been doing might come back to bite us. I want to offer one way of approaching these 3 challenges. And for that, I go back to my earlier days in order to go into the future. So it's back to the future, and I would like to articulate what I call as the platform perspective. On the left-hand side, you will see the socio-cognitive model again. Here I call this as discursive constitution of platforms. Why discursive constitution of platforms? Because it was through these 3 things, beliefs, evaluation criteria, and artifacts, that the different camps in cochlear implant were making the case which way to proceed, single channel or multi-channel. And at the bottom, I labeled that as material construction of platforms. And that alludes to work not only by myself, but many other people around on things such as architecture, standards, interoperability, modularity, integrity, and upgradability. And the combination of the two, for me, leads to what I will call as the platform perspective. Let me explain the platform perspective very briefly. So these are platforms for participative experimentation by a number of people with different perspectives who join the platform to collectively engage with each other and design prototypes which allow for reflection in and through action. And this is the cycle of people joining, engaging, prototyping, and reflecting. The premises underlying the platform perspective of participative experimentation are, going back to the views on technologies, innovation, management, are as follows. Of course, the technologies are mediating the interactions, but they're also constituting, because in the very act of interacting and prototyping, new ideas come about, new products come about, and new identities are constituted. Innovation is both substance and process, by which I mean that there are intermediary states which provide ways from which people can depart. So innovation is both the outcome of this interaction and the medium for future interactions. It is always in the making and never complete. Management is both heterarchy and hierarchy in the following sense, that agency rights are distributed across the people, but at the same time, at different points in time, there will be pockets of people who have got better knowledge than the others. And in that case, they take on the agency rights. I believe such a view is critical to address the three challenges I raised: the immediate pandemic, which is upon us, the inevitable rise of artificial intelligence, and the inexorable march towards unsustainability if we don't do something about it. I'd like to provide one example of this platform perspective in action, which I studied with my colleague Peter Kano, and that was the wind turbine. And we studied wind turbines in Denmark and compared and contrasted the wind turbines, the process which emerged, unfolded in the West Coast in America, in California. So we conceptualized participants from regulation, evaluation, design and production, and use. And they were interacting with the technology which was developing over time. There was a big difference between what happened in Denmark and what happened in America. In Denmark, they created a platform. The test centers created a platform of knowledge in which, through the interactions of these various actors with different frames of reference and different levels of inclusion, knowledge about wind turbines steadily improved and increased in a process that we call as bricolage, making do with things at hand. This was a collective act of bricolage. In contrast, in the US, there was very little interactions between these actors. And the main proponents were trying to create a breakthrough design. As the data shows, that despite having meager resources, the Danish wind turbine industry, the collective, it gained market share, which is the dark blue line, over time, and outcompeted their counterparts in America, who had more resources and yet fared poorly. Which brings me to the conclusion of my talk. I started off by asking if Tim has a distinctive place at the Academy, and I'd like to affirm that. Never in our history can Tim play a more important role than as of today. The technology black box is opening up. Here you see drones carrying boxes, which might happen now because of the COVID-19. You find autonomous driving, which is happening underneath our feet. We see cyborgs, robots, and humans interacting with each other. At the bottom, you see gene splicing, and then you see a turtle choking on plastic. And finally, our desire for a greener world. I think that the technologies that we have created and can create, the innovations that we can engender, and the processes that are involved, and the management of these, which brings in multiple people involved, are critical for us to understand how we navigate and transit to a new world, which is better for us. I want to thank you for your attention and for sticking with me on this talk. Thank you very much.